Hey everyone, and welcome. My name is Vanessa Chase Lokshin. Great to be here with all of you today for the first episode of Summer Fundraising, our weekly live broadcast on fundraising inspiration and ideas. So I know some of you might already be here in the webinar room with us, and if you are, welcome. I just sent out a quick message in the chat box, so hopefully some of you saw that. If you're already logged in, you may need to just refresh to get the audio and video started. And if it's taking a minute, just be patient. We'll give it a minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who are joining us over on Facebook Live, hey and welcome. And if you want to join in the conversation that we're having here on Crowdcast, which is where we're mainly broadcasting from, you can go to crowdcast.io/Vanessa E. Chase, and you'll be able to find a listing for this event there. So I hope you all are doing well. I'd love to hear just what's up for you this week, how your week is going so far, and I hope everything is well. I know we have a couple people joining us. I see Pat's already logged in, and we've got a few other people as well, which is terrific. So before we get started, I thought I would just kind of introduce this new series that we're running this summer called Summer Fundraising, which was an idea I had a couple of weeks ago when we were just thinking about new content that we could bring you all for the summer months. And I really wanted to be able to come to you more often in live video. It's one of the things I enjoy most. And I just think it's much more interactive and interesting sometimes than reading and writing blog posts for you. So I thought this would be a fun and really interesting way to have discussions with a lot of you and also bring in some more guests to the conversations, which is definitely what we're going to be doing here in the next couple of weeks. And really the idea behind it was that summertime is often kind of a slow season for fundraising, and it can be a time that can be really boring in some offices, or sometimes you just feel like you want to slack off a little bit. So I thought instead of doing that this year, why don't we have great conversations about fundraising that are inspiring and interesting, and hopefully will provide you with some really great food for thought for your work this summer and hopefully beyond. So hopefully a lot of you are interested in that. It seems like it. And I'm really excited to bring quite a wide range of topics to you this summer. We've been booking guests for the next couple of weeks. We've got a couple of really great folks coming on to talk about all sorts of different topics related to fundraising and communications. And I also want to say, if there's something you're interested in hearing about in a future episode, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. You can send me an email anytime to vanessa@storytellingnonprofit.com, or you can also message me in the chat box as well. I always check that in addition. So great to be here with everyone. I do want to dive right into what we're going to talk about here today, which is really all about keeping your fundraising on track in 2017. And I wanted to start with just a bit of a question for those of you who are tuning in, and I'd love for you to let me know in the chat box what your thoughts are on this. But I'd really love to know, how is 2017 going for your organization so far in terms of fundraising? Has it been pretty successful? Are you feeling like you're on track towards your goals? Are you feeling like you've still got a little ways to go? And I'll pause here and just let folks share your answers in the chat box. As I said, you can do that over on the right-hand side of your screen. Great. So yeah, Lisa, so you said you're a little bit behind your goals. I feel that way too. I'm a little bit behind on some of the goals I set for myself this year. And it's also the midway point. So it's kind of not that uncommon not to have reached the goals that you may have set for yourself. Maybe there's still a little ways to go, or campaigns that you're going to be rolling out through the fall. Yeah, Jen, so you said you're getting ready to start a campaign right now, so gearing up for that phase. Absolutely, yeah. Sometimes when we're working towards some of those bigger goals that we have for ourselves in fundraising, there's a lot of prep work that goes into that and getting ready to launch something and successfully execute it. So sometimes it's a little bit of, I guess, what I would call a waiting period, so to speak. And Shelley, you said you're on track, but getting more difficult in your area. Yeah, so there's lots of experiences, and I'm sure for those of you who are tuning in and listening as well here on Crowdcast and over on Facebook, it's kind of an interesting question, and it's one I wanted to talk about because I think so often we set these goals, we create fundraising plans for ourselves, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult to make sure we're still staying on track for that. And it's because most often we're dealing with what I call the tyranny of the urgent, right? There's all these other things that are coming up for us, whether it's email or, managing other things, managing other people in our offices, new opportunities, requests from donors, requests from our ED or board members, all of these other things, right? that really need our attention sometimes, that are the urgent things. And so often what I find when I talk to people is that these urgent and sometimes tyrannical things are really taking over their schedules and preventing them from actually working on the things that they really need to work on to reach some of those goals. And so part of what I wanted to do here today was just kind of have a bit of a conversation and almost, I would say, a reality check sometimes about what it is we're really spending our time on. And thank you, Sheena. I really appreciate that. Amen to that for sure. It's, it's such an interesting thing. And I find it's true probably no matter what kind of organization you work in, and even in, the for-profit and government sectors as well, we're constantly dealing with time management issues. But when we really have to get down to the brass tacks of working towards these goals that we have for ourselves, we really have to get real with ourselves about how we're spending our time and if we're spending our time on the right things to be able to make progress towards those goals. So part of what I wanted to talk about here with all of you today is a little bit about, what can we do to sort of think about the progress we're making and how we can sort of think about how we can make better progress in the weeks and months to come. I think one of the other things that really struck me about this topic and talking about goal setting and progress towards goals is that I often see that there's so much information out there about fundraising tactics and how to run successful campaigns or direct mail appeals, things like that. But a lot of that really bypasses this more fundamental conversation that we need to have about setting goals and managing those goals for ourselves. And that's always why I think it's so important to just take a step back a little and think about, what are those things that we've set for ourselves and how can we actually make sure we work towards achieving those things? So that's what I hope we can have a conversation about here today. And as always, I would love to welcome your questions and thoughts on this topic as well. You can submit questions as we go along if you'd like. Just below the video feed, you'll see there's a big red button and you can click there to submit questions if you'd like. You can also submit them in the chat box as well. Either of those places will make sure your questions get answered. So there's 3 tips I wanted to talk about in regards to making sure you keep your fundraising on track this year. And I also created a little worksheet for everyone, something that I personally use in my work that I feel has been really helpful to keep me on track and accountable with my goals. And I'm going to share that with you here in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about some of these tips first, and then I'll share the worksheet with you if you'd like to download that. So the first thing that I think is always really important when we talk about keeping ourselves on track with our fundraising program is really, number one, knowing what our goals are. So often I have conversations with people and I ask them, well, what are your goals for this year? And they're like, well, we need to fundraise for our budget. And it's like, well, how much money is that really? Or, they have other goals, but they're really not concretely defined. And it's really valuable to step back and make sure you know what you're actually spending your time and resources and energy working towards, and being really clear about that. Because it's easy, as I said, to get caught up with all these other things that kind of catch our attention or seem more urgent. But ultimately, we have to come back to that big thing that we're trying to achieve for the year for our organization. So if you're not sure what that is, or maybe it's just been a while since you took a look at that number or you took a look at your fundraising plan, I really encourage you to do that now. We're at the midpoint of the calendar year. This is a fantastic time to just check in with yourself and remember what were some of those goals that you laid out for the year. I would also say if you are working on a fiscal year calendar that ends on June 30th, not 31st, June 30th, and your new fiscal year is starting July 1st, this is probably the time of year where you're wrapping up and evaluating how your fiscal year went for 2016, 2017. There we go. So you might be planning for the next fiscal year if that's when your year starts on July 1st. And so you might be in a slightly different place at this point in the calendar year anyways, and thinking about, what do you need to set goals for next year? What things worked this year and what didn't? Where do you want to take your fundraising program? What are some opportunities to grow it and expand it? Those are all the kinds of really generative questions that you and your team can ask yourselves to figure out what the next best step will be as you plan for the next calendar year. Another thing that I find really helpful in keeping track of goals and making sure that I'm making meaningful progress towards those is regularly checking in with myself. And that's the second tip that I want to offer for you, is regularly checking back what kind of progress you've made. And sometimes having those goals in place is great. That's always the first step that we want to look at. But the next thing we want to think about is what are some of those milestones or significant markers that we want to meet on the road to getting to that goal? So what are some things that we want to think about or kind of road markers that we want to look out for that suggest that we're making positive progress toward those goals? And some people might call these key performance indicators or metrics. You can think about those however you'd like to. I personally always like to think about them more as like milestones towards that goal. So if you're working towards, let's say, a hard number for your fundraising program, maybe you've broken it down quarter by quarter or maybe month by month based on what kind of fundraising campaigns you're working on. And really knowing what those numbers are that you need to hit along the way to reach that larger goal. And of course, just that big fundraising number may not be the only thing you're working towards. You might also be working towards something like a donor retention goal or donor acquisition goals, things like that. And you can use that same process to sort of roll back and take a look at what it is you're working towards achieving and if you're making progress towards that. There's been some points in my work where I found it really useful to actually have a weekly check-in with myself on Friday afternoons, and I would schedule it in my calendar, usually for after lunch for just 15 minutes or half hour. And I would really look at what did I get done this week, and did I actually make progress towards the goals that I said were really important to me. And being able to do that on a weekly basis sometimes is useful because it just gives you that extra bit of accountability. I find sometimes that's not always where my head's at, and I don't necessarily need that. But being sure and sort of making sure that I at least have a monthly check-in on goals and important things like that, looking at metrics, growth, things like that, is really useful because then that helps me set my priorities for the following month to really figure out what it is I want to focus on. So those are kind of two goal-related tips. The last thing I want to talk about is what happens if you find that you're not going anywhere near the direction of the goals that you hoped you were going for. In other words, maybe your fundraising has gotten a little off track and you're worried you're not going to meet your goals, or you're worried that you're not quite going to reach what you said you were going to reach this year. So one of the things I always do when I work on a fundraising plan or even plans for the storytelling nonprofit is I always, in addition to having that primary plan, lay out a plan B and a plan C for myself. I don't always do this for every single thing that I do, but I find it's really helpful, and it gives me a peace of mind to know that if something isn't going right, I have two other ideas on troubleshooting. So I know exactly what I can do if something isn't working the way I'd hoped it was. And you can think about this for your fundraising campaigns as well. Sometimes I think that a lot of times we take the posture that we work on appeals or direct mail, things like that, and we send it out and we kind of hope for the best. So it's like, well, we sent it out once, what's done is done kind of thing, right? I don't necessarily think that's true. There's a lot of other things you could do to kind of create plans B and C for things like that, whether it's sending out another piece, sending out additional emails, looking at your metrics to see what's working and testing certain things, doing additional outreach to people more directly if you're working in major gifts. Whatever that is, it's really valuable to think about what those contingency plans are. And for those of you who tend to be more type A worriers, probably like myself, having these things in place is really helpful because it's going to help you feel like you know what to do if things are not going well for you. I always do this with bigger projects. For those of you who worked on bigger things like capital campaigns before, you might very well know that sometimes things don't go as planned. And it's really useful to think about having those contingency plans in place so you know exactly how you're going to reach that goal, even if it's not quite on track as you had hoped it would be. So those were the couple of tips I wanted to share with you just to start us off. And so just to recap quickly, number one, know what your goals are and review those regularly. Secondly, check your progress towards your goals and make sure that you're working on the right things to take you towards those goals. And lastly, have a plan B and a plan C in the event that things are not going as planned for you. And that will give you some peace of mind and some ideas around contingency planning for what to do in the event that something is not working out the way it should. And I want to put it out there as we're talking here today. If you have questions about contingency planning, maybe you're thinking about a campaign that you're running or something you're working on, and you're like, well, I'm not really sure what I would do for plan B or plan C. let me know what it is. I'd be happy to brainstorm with you here on this this episode. So you can send in your information in the chat box if you'd like, or you can also submit questions using the big red button just below this video feed here. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, I did want to just provide you all with a worksheet that I promised. I'm just going to grab the link and I'm going to put it in the chat box for all of you who are over here on Crowdcast. We'll put it on Facebook a little later. So what is this? It's a file you can download in Dropbox. It's basically what I call a dashboard. And a dashboard is just a fancy way of saying some sort of setup to keep track of information. This one in particular is really geared towards fundraising. And you could also use it for other things if you wanted to. But there's basically two key components on here that I think are really helpful. So it's always got your yearly goals at the top and also your monthly goals, so that each week you're reminded of what it is you're focusing on, so that you can hopefully let some of the tyranny of the urgent go by the wayside, at least a little bit anyways, and focus on what those really key things are. From there, when I do sort of granular planning for myself on a daily or weekly basis, the number one thing I always want to know are, what are those tasks that are concretely going to help me move towards those goals? I want to stay really focused and really clear on what those are. So you'll see on this worksheet, there's three little task boxes, if you will, where you can actually fill in three possible tasks that will help you move towards those monthly goals that you've set for yourself. So I hope that's helpful. It's just a pretty simple worksheet, but hopefully something that will give you a little bit more structure as you're thinking about how to work towards those goals this summer and even beyond. So I just want to check to see if we've had any questions come in. And I also want to say too, if you have questions not specifically related to this topic, but other things about fundraising or communications, you're welcome to submit those as well. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer those for you all as well. Judy, I saw you said you're on track and doing okay with your goals, but some of your materials were delayed, so you hope you'll catch up soon. Oh, I hope so too. It's never fun when mailhouse stuff is delayed for whatever reason. I've definitely had that happen before. So one of the things that I often do, especially with print campaigns, is making sure that we always build in like extra buffer time to make sure that we always get things out on the timelines that we're hoping for. So whether that's giving myself an extra couple of days in between submitting something and making sure it gets approved, whatever that looks like, making sure there's kind of baked in time for things to potentially go wrong. Sometimes that's helpful. Yeah, so Sheena, so you asked, how do I create systems for getting things done in a timely manner? Thank you letters are taking you forever and I'm working in Excel. Yeah, such a good question. So I feel like this question about systems is really useful to think about when we're talking about time management and working towards goals. So sometimes when you hear people talk about systems or creating a system for something, it sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. But basically, it's a process, the step-by-step breakdown of what you do to get from A to B, to start something and finish something. So with thank you letters, your process would be, how do I make sure we get those thank you letters mailed? What I always recommend people do when they're initially sort of creating a system and working through that process piece is actually do the activity once. And as you do it, either have a file open on your desktop or just take notes in a notebook and write down every single thing you did. I know this seems probably tedious, especially if you're doing a mail merge, but it's really useful to write down all those steps. You can see exactly what's happening. So I did this and then I did this. So maybe it's pulling a donor file from your database and putting it into Excel and then mail merging it with the letter, printing the letters, printing labels for the envelopes, and then stuffing the envelopes and getting them out, something like that. Anyways, the point is just to write that down, to start with that anyways. And then you have a basic working knowledge or draft of what that system is. So what you want to do from there, and what I do when I work on systems with organizations and even for myself, is then think about, okay, where in this system is it really ineffective? So where is it taking me too much time or too much resources, or it's just not going as efficiently as I think it should be, right? And that's where you want to think about, okay, well, what could I do to change this up? Does it mean maybe using a different process or using a different program, something like that? Yeah, I see, Sheena, you said looking for bottlenecks. Absolutely. So that's where I think writing down things first and then thinking about reflectively, where are the bottlenecks, where are things kind of getting a little bit sticky, can be really helpful to help make that workflow much more effective. I can tell you one thing I've done for thank you letters before. I know sometimes people say best practice is to get them out within like 24 to 48 hours. If you're a small organization, sometimes that's really unreasonable. So yeah, exactly. That's kind of a crazy standard, especially if you're a small organization and you're really trying to do a lot of things all at once. There's a few different things you could think about. When I was working more as a one-person shop at an organization, I scheduled once a month to do thank you letters, which might be have a lot of lag time for someone who donated literally 30 days ago. But it's what we could do and what I could swing given all the other things I was working on. So once a month, I would sit down and run the process for thank you letters. And it would typically take me half a day or something, sometimes longer, depending on the volume of donations that we got in. But I always knew that that was the designated day every single month that I processed thank you letters and got them out the door. And typically I would just set that as a recurring calendar request in my own work calendar so that I knew this was the day it had to get done. And doing some sort of like batch content or batch process like that can be helpful, because rather than doing like one or two every day or just doing them as they come in, you're really just dedicating a chunk of time, and doing it all at once is going to be much more efficient for you than kind of breaking up that task and doing it all the time, anytime, basically. That's something where I see a lot of people have a real opportunity to sort of be a little bit more efficient, especially in those recurring tasks that are happening for you at work, where you can kind of block time basically to do a series of things all at once rather than breaking it up and switching tasks more frequently during the week. So that's something you can certainly think about, Sheena, if you're thinking about how to kind of speed up that process. I noticed you said you're thinking about just bottlenecks in your system. And I'm really curious, as you're thinking about that, what do you think has been stopping you, or what do you think has been really frustrating in this process? Yeah, no, I'm really glad that's been helpful. So you said you do it monthly and you're going to try to do it weekly. Yeah, so I would really recommend, if you're going to do it weekly, maybe schedule, an hour or two, one day a week where you can work on that. Maybe it's like a Wednesday or something. Pick a time when it's a little bit slower if that's the case. So you can try to work on that a little bit more. Yeah, so you said one of your bottlenecks is separating monthly donors, banquet donors, Mother's Day donors, keeping track of that. Yeah, definitely. So if you have a lot of segmentation in thank you letters, that can for sure make it a little bit more difficult. So there's a couple of things that I would probably try there. So one, you could potentially, if you've tagged things based on segment in your database, you can try downloading separate files for each segment. That might mean you have to run a couple of reports more initially, but by the time you get to setting up the letters for the merge, you'll have the files already and you won't have to sort of separate out the data in the Excel file. You could also do it the other way, where you download one report, and then one of your bigger tasks is to actually separate out which people are in which category for the mail merge, and then creating a separate tab for each of those in Excel. I know it's probably one of the more tedious tasks in mail merges and getting something like that done. Yeah, and so you said also sometimes people are in multiple categories, so you're editing letters one by one. Yeah, so one of the things I would think about doing there is, if you do have a lot of people who are in multiple categories, see if you can change some of your merge fields. Make them so that you can account for people being in multiple categories, and so that you don't have to manually type things out for each of those people. Sometimes that might mean that you might make more of your letter a variable field so you can account for that. But that might take a lot of the work off your plate if you're finding you have to manually adjust a lot of those letters in the process, for sure. All right, so I saw a couple of other questions coming about this. Yeah, Gwen, so that's also your process as well. You said you're new in your position and documenting the process for each event, campaign, etc. So it's more streamlined second time around. Absolutely. I always recommend that people do that, especially when you're new. If you find there's not much process in place, it can be really useful to actually build out some of those processes and think about, especially since you're new to the organization and the position, you sort of have a fresh perspective on it. And you can hopefully make some good recommendations about how to improve some of those things. Yeah, so I think it's Ami. You asked, or maybe Amy, is it better to have more smaller campaigns or a few larger campaigns? That's a good question. I would say it really depends on what your organization has done. Here's the thing that I think people do not often account for in fundraising programs, which is this. How you have interacted with donors in the years leading up to now is how you have trained them to interact with you. So if they are used to receiving a lot of campaigns a year and people give multiple times a year that way, if you suddenly change things up, you're probably going to see some changes in giving patterns, and that might affect your revenue line. So that's something to think about. I see this happen a lot with organizations that are transitioning from offline campaigns to more of a digital campaign or a digital platform for their fundraising. They think that, oh, like it's going to be a really easy switch. We have email addresses, yada, yada, right? But it never is. And that's because they've historically had people giving through direct mail, and suddenly asking them to give through the website or through email, whatever that might be, means that they have to change their habit, which can be really difficult to facilitate for people. So in sort of evaluating what you've done and what sort of changes you want to make, I'd really recommend thinking about what have you done before. So have you sent out a lot of several smaller campaigns? And has that worked well? And if it has, my inclination is to always say you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So if something is working well, keep leveraging it and keep doing that until it doesn't work well for you, and then look at making changes. That may not seem like the most proactive approach, but I think one of the problems that I often see at a lot of fundraising offices is that we're constantly looking for the next thing, the next trend, and we're forgetting about all the other things that already work for us, and we're sort of leaving those pieces out. So I'd really encourage you to think about that question of, is fewer small campaigns, are more small campaigns working for you? Or if you're doing larger campaigns and fewer of those, is that working better? So you might want to think about that question first before you make any sort of radical changes there. Yeah, and I feel like I've seen that many times in the last few years with some of my clients and the folks that I work with through the classes I teach, which is that they're often looking to make some sort of really big change in their fundraising program. And most often it's moving to more of a digital program. So they want to have an email fundraising program, or they want to be doing more fundraising through their website, things like that. And one of the things they're not accounting for is sort of this, I guess what I would call like the uptake curve, and getting people to get on board with what the organization is now doing. And that can be really challenging, I think anyways, because we want to make that pivot in how we're fundraising, but there can be some lag in revenue before it picks up again. And sometimes we don't always account for that, which can be really stressful, right? So yeah, Carrie, so is there a software program that I recommend for smaller organizations trying to organize donor info? Yeah, I would absolutely recommend Bloomerang, and I'll type that in here. That's always my preferred one for smaller groups. There's a lot of options out there for organizing donor data and databases. Certainly there's things like Salesforce or Blackbaud products, both of which are very big and very clunky to use, especially if you're a smaller organization. Yeah, and Shelly, I'm glad you like Bloomerang too. I personally like Bloomerang because it's a online CRM, so you can use it through your web browser. It's highly secure. They have great technology, and I just find the interface is really intuitive compared to other ones that I've worked with. And for an organization that's just starting out, where you don't necessarily need something super fancy that's going to allow you to do high-level reports and segmentation and things like that, something like this will work really well. Yeah, so Sheena, how many donors is a good size for Bloomerang? It's a good question. I've never thought about that before. I mean, I think my inclination is to say that your Excel spreadsheet is no longer going to work when it's becoming too messy. There's too many rows of data, which I'm guessing is probably somewhere between the 200 to 500 range mark. And that might not seem like a lot of donors to warrant getting a database, but I have to say, if you're in it for the long run and you're planning on growing this organization and growing your fundraising program, having clean and organized data is going to save you so many headaches down the road. You'll be so glad that you spent the time early on to get a good process and system in place for managing your data, rather than having to make the transition to a database when you've got, thousands of records or something like that. It can be really difficult. So I would really encourage you to think about doing it now, even if you think, oh, I'm not really sure it's worth it for us. Maybe it's too soon. If your organization is really feeling like it's going to be here for the long run, and that's like your goal is being around for 10, 20 plus years doing this kind of service, you definitely want to have a database in place. Yeah, and I think Bloomerang, if you go to their website, one of the things I appreciate about them is that they actually have plans based on how many donor records you have. So if you're a smaller group that doesn't have as many donor records, it'll be a lot less expensive. So that's also something you might want to think about. Yeah. All right, Kelly, any advice for one-person development team in setting priorities and reaching goals? Yeah, so if you're a one-person shop and you're just running the whole development program yourself, there's a couple of things to think about with setting goals. I always come back to what is the number one thing that you're trying to do, and it's probably raising money, I'm guessing. So when I'm setting goals and priorities for something like that, I always want to be looking at what are the activities and tasks on a monthly or weekly basis that are actually going to help me do that. So maybe, focusing on your campaigns, getting out the door to major gifts visits, building up, what else am I thinking of? Building up your email list so you have more people to email, things like that. It's really easy to get into the habit of doing other things and thinking that they're helping you, but not really. And by that, I mean often social media or, I don't know, getting sucked into other kinds of communications work sometimes in fundraising can kind of veer you off the path a little. But to me, I always come back to, what are the things that will measurably bring in money and what are the things that will measurably help me build relationships? So those are the things that I would really look at in terms of setting priorities and goals for yourself. I'm sure, Kelly, for your organization, your fundraising goal is probably dictated by whatever your organization's budget might be. So you may not have a lot of say on that and may not have a lot of wiggle room with what that big goal might be, but you do have a lot of leeway in figuring out how you achieve that goal and what kind of priorities you set for yourself. So you might want to think about, in the long run, what are your organization's goals for its fundraising program? Would you like to have a really built out major gifts program? Are you really interested in building out a robust direct response fundraising program through annual giving, for instance? And looking at those things can be super useful to help you figure out what's going to make the most sense for you this year or even next year. I hope that's helpful. We've got a couple more questions here before we wrap up. So another one here from Amy. So how would you advise establishing or introducing a donor program from the business or corporate community? I'm not sure I totally understand that question, Amy. You might have to clarify that for me. So do you mean introducing a donor program for like corporate giving? So something like corporate social responsibility or getting companies to participate in employee giving? Maybe you can let me know. I'm hoping that's what you mean. Otherwise, I'm not totally sure. Maybe I'll give you a second to type that in. I'll go to Carrie's question quickly while we wait to hear back on that. So Carrie, you asked for event tickets. We've used Eventbrite or Ticket Tailor, but they're convenient, but cut into our profits. Do I have any other suggestions? Not really. I have to say, event fundraising is not my forte. So I don't have a lot of information around how to better sort of make that more efficient or more effective. There are a lot of other ticket providers. I feel like I've heard Pictactic is a good one. And let me just type it in. I think this is how you spell it. I think that's it. I'm sure if you Google Pictactic ticket provider, you might come up with something. I feel like I've heard a couple of organizations use that. A lot of people use Eventbrite because it's fairly easy to use and a pretty common one. If you have the ability to host your own donation forms on your website, you may just want to set up something like that where you have your own hosted payment form on your website. You could certainly use PayPal or, you could use FormStack if you have a payment processor you're really happy with. It might be a little bit more work to set up, but if your goal is to kind of cut back on how much money you're losing to some of these other providers for ticket sales, that might be something worth looking into. All right, so Amy, you said corporate giving to nonprofits. Oh, such a good question. So one of the things I learned years ago that was super valuable to me about corporate giving, which is so different from individual philanthropy, is that corporations are typically not motivated to give for the same reasons that individuals are giving, which probably comes as no surprise to a lot of you. A lot of corporations are motivated by marketing opportunities and the opportunity for increased brand awareness or brand partnership, which is so different from getting people, an individual, to give because it feels good, because they want to give back to the community. A corporation has another agenda, and it's really important to think about, what is that agenda, and how can you sort of create a sponsorship package or some sort of donation opportunity that will help them both reach their goals and be able to give back to your organization. So I found with corporate giving, most often this means you have to have a lot of one-on-one conversations with companies to figure out what that can look like for them, especially if you're looking at having them give, gifts over $1,000, or maybe more in the major gifts range. So thinking about, how can you offer them volunteer opportunities or team building opportunities through volunteering for their company? How can you help get their name out there if they're looking for some different marketing or exposure opportunities, things like that? Really understanding what their goals are for giving is so important. And I can hypothesize as to what those commonly are for organizations, but I'll tell you the best thing you can do is have those conversations one-on-one with people who are the decision makers at the companies you're interested in soliciting, and doing the relationship building work to make sure that you really tailor an opportunity that'll work well for that company. All right, we'll go to one last question here from Jen. Any suggestions on starting a planned giving program focusing mainly on wills and bequests? Yes, I can give you one really good tip on this that's worked well for me over the years. If you're really looking to identify prospects, if that's sort of step one for you, is identifying prospects and letting people know about planned giving, one of the best things you can do is run a survey to your donor audience. And this is not a survey looking to get to know them. Your goal is to identify giving prospects for planned giving. So in this survey, one of the key questions you're going to want to ask is, did you know that our organization offers planned giving opportunities where you can give through your will or estate or legacy, something like that? It's a badly worded question. The gist is, you want to ask people, did you know that you can give through your will or estate as a part of your philanthropy to our organization? And then your follow-up question to that is going to be, would you like more information about how to leave a gift in your will or leave a legacy to our organization? And that question, if people answer yes, is going to help you generate a prospect list of people who are already in your donor base. Now, you may want to send out the survey to your entire donor list. You very well could. If you have a large donor file, you probably want to focus on people who've been giving frequently and who've been giving, for, I would say, at least 5 years. So people who have some established donor loyalty to your organization is certainly one thing you want to look at. Monthly donors are often great prospects for legacy giving as well. So if you're targeting this survey, you may also want to think about that. But when it comes to just marketing and like getting the program out and getting it started, sometimes just letting people know about it in a survey is one very useful way to kind of softly pitch it and be able to build that prospect list. In terms of more of the logistics of it, you may want to consult with a lawyer. There are often law firms and towns who will consult with nonprofits pro bono, and you might want to ask them questions about how to set up proper structures for receiving things like gifts of stock or real estate, stuff like that. And they will have much better ideas about how to kind of set up the back end systems to make sure that you can receive gifts like that if you get those from people. So a couple of quick tips on that. I hope that's helpful, Jen, as you're thinking about your planned giving program. Planned giving is such an interesting area. And I know one of the tough challenges for a lot of organizations is that for years you just get gifts out of nowhere and you're like, oh, this is great. How do we get more of these? And so prospecting becomes the big challenge there. But I found with a couple of groups that I've worked with, running legacy donor surveys is one really fantastic first step to making that happen, because you can build up an internal prospect list of people who already know, like, and trust your organization and who are most likely to give to your organization. All right, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up this edition of Summer Fundraising. I hope you've enjoyed it. I really enjoyed answering all of your questions. I want to let you know that we're going to be doing this every Tuesday at the same time. Next week is a little bit special. It happens to be my birthday, so I'm going to do a special episode on things I've learned about fundraising this last year to share with you. There's been a lot of things I've learned about fundraising this last year, so hopefully those will be useful to you and help you avoid some of the mistakes that I've made this year. I also wanted to let you all know before we get going, I am teaching a live webinar coming up on June 21st. It's a planning retreat for fundraising. So if you're thinking about planning your second half of the year, or you're ready to get a solid fundraising plan in place for your organization, I hope you'll check it out. Just below the live video feed here, you'll see a green button. You can click on that to find out a little bit more information. And if you're interested in signing up, we do have a promo code in place that you can use to save 50% on registration. The code is the word PLAN, P-L-A-N. So you can use that at checkout if you'd like to register. And we'll be sending out some more information about next week's episode of Summer Fundraising. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a fantastic rest of the week and take care. Bye, everyone.